The entire conversation around Shedeur Sanders has been loud, chaotic, and relentlessly driven by one thing: numbers. Scroll social media, turn on sports radio, skim the headlines, and you'll see the same argument recycled over and over again. His QBR, his stat lines, his win-loss record. To most people watching from the outside, the verdict already felt written. Another young quarterback overwhelmed by the league. Another gamble that didn't immediately pay off. But inside the Browns building, that narrative never fully landed. And when Cleveland's general manager finally spoke, it became clear that the organization wasn't just disagreeing with the noise, they were outright rejecting it. In a league where front offices usually hide behind vague answers and carefully worded non-answers, Andrew Berry did something unexpected. He drew a clear line in the sand. While analysts were dissecting spreadsheets like gospel and debating whether Sanders had already shown his ceiling, Berry zoomed out and reframed the entire conversation. His message wasn't defensive, it wasn't emotional, it was deliberate. The Browns weren't evaluating Sanders based on a snapshot. They were studying the entire picture, the circumstances, the pressure, the growth that doesn't show up in box scores. And that distinction matters more than most fans realize. What made Berry's comments so explosive wasn't just the confidence behind them, it was the timing. Sanders was coming off a season where every mistake felt magnified, every quiet moment interpreted as doubt, every low number turned into ammunition. The easy move would have been to hedge, to talk about competition, to lean into the idea of keeping options open. But Berry didn't do that. He publicly tied his credibility to Sanders' development and made it clear that the organization wasn't flinching. In a league that devours young quarterbacks before they finish learning how to survive, that kind of backing is rare and risky. And here's where things get interesting. Berry wasn't asking fans to ignore the struggles. He wasn't pretending the rookie year was smooth or pretty. What he was saying, indirectly, was something much more uncomfortable for critics to deal with: that struggles don't always mean failure. Sometimes they mean foundation. Sometimes they're exactly what a quarterback needs before things start to click. And when Berry said the Browns were focused on growth over noise, he wasn't talking in hypotheticals. He was pointing to moments, decisions, and responses that told a different story than the one circulating online. Because buried beneath the QBR debates and the hot takes was something most people missed. While the narrative said Sanders was drowning, the Browns saw someone learning how to stay afloat under pressure that would have broken plenty of rookies. They saw a quarterback absorbing hits, criticism, and chaos without imploding. And they saw flashes, not the flashy viral kind, but the kind that make coaches lean forward in their chairs instead of reaching for the panic button. Berry's stance wasn't about defending a pick, it was about acknowledging a process that was unfolding quietly while everyone else was yelling. And that's the real tension driving this story. Not whether Sanders had a rough rookie season, that part is obvious. The real question is why Cleveland seems so comfortable betting against public opinion. Why a general manager known for being analytical, reserved, and calculated would speak with such certainty. And most importantly, what happened behind the scenes that convinced the Browns this wasn't a quarterback problem, but a patience problem? Because once you start asking that, the conversation shifts fast, and the answers lead to moments that didn't make highlight reels, but changed how the Browns see their future. It didn't take long for the conversation around Shedeur Sanders to narrow into something painfully simple. One number: QBR. In an era where fans demand instant answers and social media thrives on quick verdicts, that stat became the easiest way to label his rookie season. Every incomplete pass, every stalled drive, every loss fed into the same conclusion that the experiment wasn't working. It didn't matter how the games unfolded or what Sanders was asked to handle snap after snap, the number told a story. And once that story caught fire, it became the only thing people wanted to talk about. The reason QBR took over the narrative was convenience. It allowed critics to bypass context entirely. Instead of discussing protection breakdowns, blown routes, or play designs that collapsed before they had a chance to breathe, debates could be reduced to one screenshot shared endlessly online. Analysts leaned on it because it was clean, fans leaned on it because it felt definitive, and the louder that number became, the easier it was to ignore everything happening around it. Sanders wasn't being evaluated as a rookie learning on the fly. He was being measured against an expectation timeline that rarely matches reality. What made the situation worse was timing. Sanders stepped into meaningful snaps at a point when patience was already thin in Cleveland. The fan base had seen too many resets, too many promises of development that never quite paid off. So when the numbers didn't immediately pop, frustration turned into skepticism almost overnight. Conversations stopped being about progress and started revolving around replacement. Who's next? What's the backup plan? Should the Browns move on before it's too late? QBR didn't just reflect opinion, it fueled it. And once that narrative took hold, it became self-sustaining. Every game was filtered through the same lens. A short completion on third down was dismissed. A throwaway under pressure became indecision. Even plays designed simply to avoid disaster were framed as evidence of limitation. The stat sheet didn't show when Sanders made the safe choice instead of forcing a turnover. It didn't highlight the reads that prevented momentum-swinging mistakes, but those moments never trended. The number did. The irony is that QBR, the very stat used to discredit him, was never built to stand alone. It was meant to support evaluation, not replace it. But once the public latched onto it, nuance disappeared. Sanders wasn't just underperforming, he was being defined. And that definition stuck, even as the circumstances stayed conveniently out of frame. The louder the critics got, the smaller the window became for anything positive to register. But here's the part almost no one paused to consider. When a narrative becomes that narrow, it usually means something else is being overlooked, because numbers don't explain why pressure arrives before receivers break. They don't account for learning curves, trust issues, or offenses searching for rhythm, and they certainly don't tell you how a quarterback responds when things go wrong. That's where the real story was hiding. And once you start pulling back that layer, the QBR debate begins to look a lot less definitive and a lot more incomplete. To understand what actually happened during Shedeur Sanders' rookie season, you have to step away from the numbers and look at the environment he was dropped into. Because while the QBR debates raged, almost no one slowed down enough to ask a far more important question. What was he really working with? The answer isn't flashy and it doesn't fit neatly into a stat graphic, but it explains far more than any single metric ever could. Sanders wasn't eased into the offense with a long runway of first-team reps or a settled system built around his strengths. His opportunities came in pieces, uneven, pressured, and often reactive. One week, it was limited practice time. The next, it was a reshuffled offensive line struggling to hold up long enough for plays to develop. Defenses picked up on it quickly. They didn't need exotic schemes or complicated disguises. They knew pressure would come fast, and they sent it without hesitation. For a young quarterback, that changes everything. Most fans don't realize how much early pressure warps decision-making. When pockets collapse almost immediately, a quarterback isn't reading defenses, he's surviving them. Timing goes out the window, footwork gets rushed, progressions get cut short. And yet, that context rarely made it into the conversation. Instead of acknowledging how often Sanders was forced off his spot or hit mid-throw, critics looked at the end result and assumed hesitation or inability. The reality was far less simple. What made it even tougher was the lack of consistency around him. Receivers weren't always in sync, routes didn't always break when they were supposed to, protection calls missed assignments at the worst possible moments. That kind of instability doesn't just stall drives, it fractures confidence across the entire unit. And still, Sanders kept stepping into the pocket. He didn't bail early. He didn't start freelancing to make things look better on tape. He tried to run the offense as designed, even when the design was working against him. For most rookies, those conditions lead to disaster plays, forced throws into coverage, panic interceptions, or reckless decisions that swing games in the wrong direction. That's usually when the downward spiral starts. But that's not what happened here. Sanders took hits, he absorbed sacks, he threw the ball away when the situation demanded it. Those moments don't boost QBR, but they matter deeply to coaches. Avoiding the catastrophic mistake is often the first sign of a quarterback who understands what he's being asked to do, even when it's uncomfortable. And here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. There's a difference between struggling because you don't belong and struggling because you're being tested beyond your current support system. Sanders wasn't coasting through clean pockets and missing open looks. He was navigating chaos week after week without public complaint. No excuses, no finger pointing, just film sessions, adjustments, and another attempt to make it work the next time out. That distinction is subtle, but it's everything. Once you factor that in, the story shifts. His rookie season stops looking like a failure and starts looking like a stress test, one that exposed flaws around him as much as it challenged his own development. And while most people were busy tallying numbers, the Browns were watching how he handled those conditions. Because when you survive instability without coming apart, you're building something most stat sheets will never show, and that's where this story starts moving in a very different direction. The moment that changed the tone inside the building didn't come with fireworks, and it didn't dominate highlight shows. It came late, under pressure, in a situation where most people had already stopped paying attention. Against the Cincinnati Bengals, with the game slipping away and very little on the line from the outside looking in, Shedeur Sanders stepped into a drive that quietly flipped the script for those watching closely. This wasn't the kind of situation designed to make a rookie look good. The pocket wasn't clean, the noise was loud, the defense knew what was coming and sent pressure anyway. There was no margin for error and no safety net, and yet something looked different. Sanders wasn't rushing his reads, he wasn't drifting aimlessly or forcing throws just to make something happen. He took what the defense gave him and stayed on schedule. Short gains, smart decisions, movement inside the pocket instead of panic outside of it. Every snap felt measured. What stood out wasn't the final score or even the touchdown itself. It was the composure. Sanders controlled the huddle with a calm that hadn't always shown up earlier in the season. His body language never dipped. His eyes stayed level. When protection broke down, he adjusted. When lanes closed, he moved on. That kind of poise doesn't appear out of nowhere, especially not in a young quarterback who's been absorbing criticism all season. It's built slowly, rep by rep, through exactly the kind of adversity he'd been navigating. Defensively, the Bengals weren't playing soft. They tested him. They disguised looks, crowded windows, and dared him to make mistakes. Earlier in the year, those moments might have ended drives quickly. This time, Sanders didn't flinch. He recognized the pressure, climbed the pocket, and delivered the ball where it needed to go, not for style points, but to keep the drive alive. That's the kind of football that rarely trends online, but it sticks with coaches long after the game ends. Inside that drive was the answer to weeks of questions no stat could address. Could he operate when things weren't perfect? Could he stay composed when everything sped up? Could he finish a series without unraveling under pressure? On that drive, the answers were quietly delivered. Not loudly, not dramatically, just efficiently, the way quarterbacks who understand the moment tend to play it. When the drive ended, there wasn't a celebration. There wasn't any chest thumping. Sanders walked off like it was expected, like it was part of the job, and that mattered. Because moments like that don't just change games, they change trust. They change how a locker room feels when a quarterback steps in, and they change how decision-makers view the future. For most fans, it was just another late possession in a game that was already decided, but for the Browns, it was a confirmation of something they'd been watching build behind the scenes. That drive wasn't a fluke or a desperate stretch. It was the product of learning how to survive chaos and finally owning it. And once that happened, the conversation around Sanders stopped being theoretical, because now there was proof on tape, the kind that doesn't scream but stays with you. When Andrew Berry finally spoke, it wasn't loud, dramatic, or fueled by emotion, and that's exactly why it landed so hard. It came during what should have been a routine press conference, the kind where front offices usually sidestep questions and protect flexibility. Instead, Berry did the opposite.
He planted his feet and made it clear that the Browns weren't wavering. There was no hedging, no talk of open competitions, no vague phrasing about seeing how things play out. He said the organization expected Shedeur Sanders to take a significant leap, and in NFL language, that kind of certainty is rare. What made the declaration so striking wasn't just the words, it was who they were coming from. Barry isn't known for emotional endorsements or spur-of-the-moment confidence boosts. His reputation around the league is analytical, measured, almost clinical. Every comment is usually filtered through long-term planning and flexibility. So when someone with that profile publicly backs a young quarterback who hasn't won over the stat crowd, it signals something deeper. This wasn't a confidence play for the cameras, it was alignment. Barry was telling everyone where the organization stood, and he wasn't worried about backlash. The timing mattered just as much as the message. Sanders had just endured weeks of criticism, with every debate circling back to QBR and whether the Browns should be thinking about alternatives. Barry could have let the noise run its course. He could have waited until the offseason cooled down.
Instead, he stepped in while the discourse was still boiling. That decision alone reframed everything. It shifted the conversation from, "Is Sanders in trouble?" to, "Why are the Browns so sure?" And that's a far more uncomfortable question for critics to answer. Barry didn't dismiss the struggles, and that's where his comments gained credibility. He didn't pretend the rookie year was flawless. What he did was emphasize evaluation in context, limited reps, protection breakdowns, high-leverage situations that weren't designed to be easy. He essentially challenged the idea that development should be judged in isolation. In his view, Sanders' season wasn't about outcomes, it was about trajectory, about whether the arrow was pointing up, and according to Barry, it was. Behind that public backing was an unspoken reality every front office understands. A general manager doesn't tie his reputation to a quarterback unless he's confident in what the film is showing. Not the highlights, not the box scores, the hidden work, the response to pressure, the way a player absorbs coaching and adjusts. By speaking the way he did, Barry wasn't just silencing rumors, he was signaling to the locker room, the coaching staff, and the league that Sanders wasn't a placeholder. He was part of the plan. And maybe the most telling part of it all was how calm Barry seemed. There was no urgency in his tone, no sense that he was trying to convince himself. It came across as settled, like the decision had already been made long before anyone asked the question. That kind of confidence doesn't grow overnight. It's built through meetings, tape sessions, and moments like that late drive against Cincinnati that confirmed what the numbers couldn't. Once those words were out, there was no walking them back. Barry had drawn his line. The Browns weren't chasing outside validation, and they weren't reacting to online pressure. They were betting on growth, patience, and a quarterback they believed was just scratching the surface. And from that point on, the story stopped being about whether Sanders would get another chance. It became about how the league would respond if Barry turned out to be right. What changed the internal conversation around Shedeur Sanders wasn't something most fans ever saw on Sundays. It happened on practice fields, in film rooms, and during the in-between moments that never make broadcasts. While the public focus stayed locked on game day results, the Browns were tracking a different set of markers, the kind that tell you whether a quarterback is actually evolving or just trying to survive. One of the first shifts came in how Sanders processed pressure. Early in the season, his instincts leaned toward extending plays, trying to make something happen even when the structure collapsed. That's common for young quarterbacks, especially ones who've had to rely on playmaking to get by. As weeks passed, that impulse started to fade. Instead of forcing throws laid across his body or drifting into unnecessary sacks, he began making quicker decisions. Throwaways replaced desperation plays. Checkdowns replaced hero attempts. Those choices don't spark highlight reels, but they keep offenses functional and quarterbacks standing. Coaches also noticed subtle improvements in his pocket movement. He wasn't bailing as quickly. He learned when to climb instead of escape, when to slide instead of spin. Those adjustments sound minor, but they're often the difference between a stalled drive and a manageable down.
Film showed Sanders keeping his eyes downfield longer, even as pressure closed in. That awareness doesn't show up in a box score, but it shows up in how coaches trust you with the playbook.
As that trust grew, so did his responsibilities. Sanders wasn't given charity reps, he earned them. More work in 2-minute drills, more red zone decision-making, more situations where the margin for error was razor thin. The staff wasn't doing this to see what happens. They were testing whether what they'd seen in practice translated under stress, and more often than not, it did. The game slowed down just enough for him to operate instead of react. Another area of growth came with his pre-snap recognition. Sanders started identifying pressure earlier, adjusting protections, and communicating more clearly with receivers. Those exchanges are quiet, almost invisible, but they matter. They're signs a quarterback is moving from executing plays to running an offense. That evolution doesn't happen all at once, and it certainly doesn't happen without mistakes, but it was happening, steadily, away from the spotlight. Perhaps the most telling change was how little his demeanor wavered. Bad reps didn't spiral into bad sessions. Missed throws didn't turn into rushed ones. Sanders stayed even-keeled, focused on correction instead of frustration. Coaches value that more than raw confidence because it's sustainable. It means a player can absorb criticism, adjust, and move on without carrying mistakes into the next snap. For fans, progress is often measured in touchdowns and wins. For teams, it's measured in habits. And Sanders was forming the right ones. He wasn't chasing viral moments or trying to flip the narrative overnight. He was stacking small improvements, one decision at a time, building the kind of foundation that only becomes obvious once it's already there. That's why when people questioned why the Browns kept doubling down, the answer wasn't complicated. They weren't betting on who Sanders had been on the stat sheet. They were betting on who he was becoming when no one was watching. And once that growth started showing up on tape, it became impossible for the organization to ignore, even if the outside world still hadn't caught up yet. As if the pressure on the field wasn't enough, Shedeur Sanders found himself dealing with a wave of off-field noise that could have easily knocked a young quarterback off course. Reports surfaced about a burglary incident, and almost instantly it became another talking point for people already looking for reasons to doubt him. The situation drew attention away from football and into his personal space, something no player, let alone a developing quarterback, ever wants in the middle of a critical stretch. What stood out wasn't the incident itself, but how Sanders responded to it. There were no emotional statements, no attempts to turn the situation into an excuse, and no public frustration aimed at the distractions piling up around him. From the outside, it would have been understandable if his focus wavered. Instead, it didn't. Within days, arrests were made, the matter was resolved, and Sanders never let it bleed into his preparation. He stayed in the facility, stayed locked in, and let the legal side handle what it needed to handle. Inside the building, that restraint didn't go unnoticed. Teammates saw a quarterback who refused to let outside chaos derail the work. Coaches saw consistency instead of excuses. For a young player still earning trust, that composure mattered more than any quote he could have given. Off-field adversity has a way of revealing whether someone leans into distraction or leans into responsibility. Sanders chose the latter. There's also a maturity in understanding what not to engage with. Sanders didn't respond with cryptic social posts or subtle jabs aimed at critics. He didn't try to control the narrative or win public sympathy. He kept things simple. Show up, prepare, repeat. That approach mirrored how he handled criticism about his play. No arguing, no defensiveness, just work. That kind of discipline isn't taught easily, especially under constant scrutiny. For the Browns, this mattered just as much as anything that happened on the field. A quarterback isn't only evaluated by how he throws when protected, he's judged by how he holds himself when things turn uncomfortable. Sanders showed he could handle pressure without unraveling, without demanding attention, and without making the situation bigger than it was. In a position where leadership is unavoidable, that's a powerful signal. The break-in could have become a turning point for the wrong reasons. Instead, it quietly reinforced what the organization had already started to believe. Sanders wasn't fragile. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't overwhelmed by being in the spotlight.
He absorbed the hit, just like he did on the field, and kept moving forward. And sometimes, how a quarterback responds when life gets loud tells you more about his future than anything that happens when the lights are on. By the time the noise faded, something else had changed too. The questions about whether he could handle the weight of the role had started to lose momentum, because while people were busy speculating, Sanders was proving, without saying a word, that distractions didn't control him. And that quiet response only deepened the trust already forming behind closed doors. Somewhere along the way, Shedeur Sanders stopped being the biggest question mark in the room and started becoming a steady presence. It wasn't marked by a big speech or a sudden shift in personality. There was no announcement, no chest pounding. The change was subtle, but everyone inside the building felt it. His tone didn't get louder, it got firmer. And in an NFL locker room, that kind of shift carries weight. Early on, Sanders was careful, almost deferential. He listened more than he spoke, absorbed feedback, and stayed in his lane. As the season progressed and the reps piled up, that approach evolved. He didn't stop listening, but he started owning space. He spoke with intention. He communicated expectations in the huddle. He corrected things quietly, without calling attention to himself. That's often the point where teammates start responding differently, not because they're told to, but because it feels natural. Leadership showed up in his preparation long before it showed up in his words. He was in the building early. He stayed late. He ran through concepts with receivers until things felt right. That consistency matters. Players notice who treats preparation like a non-negotiable. When a quarterback leads by example, instead of theatrics, it builds credibility fast, especially on a roster that's seen plenty of talk over the years. One of the most telling signs came during games when Sanders wasn't the focal point. Even from the sideline, he stayed engaged, headphones on, eyes locked on the tablet, talking through adjustments with coaches and receivers. No sulking, no detachment. That's often when leadership reveals itself, not when things are going your way, but when you're asked to stay ready without guarantees. Sanders treated every situation as part of his responsibility, regardless of the role he was in that week. His interviews reflected the same shift. The deflection faded. He stopped leaning on generalities and started speaking with clarity. When asked about criticism, he didn't complain. When asked about expectations, he didn't shrink. He acknowledged the weight of the position without dramatizing it.
That balance is rare, especially for a young quarterback under constant scrutiny. It showed someone who understood the job didn't come with applause, it came with accountability. Teammates began to trust that presence. Coaches began to lean on it. The leadership wasn't loud enough to trend, but it was steady enough to matter. And that's often how real quarterback leadership works. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it. By the time the outside world was still debating whether Sanders was the guy, the locker room had already started treating him like one. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It was built through criticism, pressure, and situations that forced growth instead of comfort. Sanders didn't chase validation, he focused on command. And once that clicked, the narrative began to change, not because anyone said it should, but because his presence made it unavoidable. At the heart of all this, the Browns aren't arguing with critics, they're making a bet. And it's not the kind that shows up cleanly on spreadsheets or stat graphics. It's a bet on Shedeur Sanders as a long-term answer, not because he overwhelmed the league right away, but because he didn't break when circumstances made it easy to fail. Cleveland isn't pretending the rookie season was perfect. They're saying it was necessary. The simplest way to explain the divide is this: the outside world judged outcomes, while the organization judged process. Fans saw low QBR and stalled drives. The Browns saw a quarterback operating inside chaos without losing control. They saw decision-making sharpen, composure settle, and leadership quietly form. That's why Andrew Berry never blinked. To him, Sanders wasn't regressing, he was accumulating experience in the hardest way possible.
And that's what makes this bet so intriguing. Cleveland didn't reset. They didn't rush toward the next shiny option or scramble to placate public frustration. They stayed patient in a league that rarely rewards it. Barry's confidence wasn't fueled by hope or optics. It was grounded in patterns he saw repeating week after week. Growth under pressure, accountability without excuses, progress that couldn't be measured until it finally showed up in moments that mattered. The drive against Cincinnati didn't flip the narrative on its own. It simply confirmed what the Browns had already been tracking behind the scenes. That poise wasn't an accident, it was built. And when a quarterback reaches that point, the conversation changes, not because stats suddenly improve overnight, but because the foundation is strong enough to support what comes next. Now, the burden shifts. Sanders isn't fighting for belief anymore. He has it. What comes next is execution, preparation, consistency, turning quiet leadership into sustained production. The Browns know that doesn't happen instantly, but they're comfortable living in that window. They've decided the risk of patience is worth more than the cost of panic. So while critics are still debating what Sanders hasn't done yet, Cleveland is investing in what he already is and what they believe he's becoming. A quarterback shaped by pressure instead of protected from it. A leader who doesn't chase noise, doesn't flinch when things get uncomfortable, and doesn't fold when the spotlight sharpens. That's the real bet, not on numbers, but on substance. And if the Browns are right, this story won't be remembered as a controversy over QBR. It'll be remembered as the beginning of something built the hard way, quietly, deliberately, and right in front of everyone who wasn't paying attention.